Good evening, everyone. I'm Gretchen Crosby Sims, the Executive Director here at the Institute of Politics, and we are really pleased to welcome White House Chief Digital Officer Ori Renat to campus this evening. We look forward to his conversation about the Trump administration's digital and social media strategy with Gilad Edelman of Wired. I do want to mention a couple of upcoming events that we've got. Tomorrow night, Thursday, February 13th, former New Orleans Mayor Mitch Landrieu will be discussing the E Pluribus Unum Fund, which is an organization focused on uniting the American South across divisive issues of race and class. Joining him will be former IOP fellow Bakari Sellers. Monday, February 17th, New York Times, Washington reporters Julie Hirschfield Davis and Michael Shear will provide an inside look into the White House's immigration policy in America, as discussed in their new book, Border Wars: Inside Trump's Assault on Immigration. UChicago's own Adam Chilton will moderate. As always, information on our events can be found on our website at politics.uchicago.edu. We will, as always, have questions after the moderated discussion, and the mic is going to be, I think, in the center aisle. As usual, we reserve the first 3 questions for students, and everybody's welcome to the mic, so don't be shy. Please do keep questions short if there are a lot of them so that we can get through everybody. I'd like to ask you to put your phones on silent. Restrooms are downstairs if you need them. And now, for our formal introduction, I want to welcome Shalia Dehipawala. Shalia is a second-year MBA student here who is incredibly involved at the IOP as the graduate co-chair of our Student Advisory Board. Before coming to UChicago, Shalia served 4 years in the Army, and he interned with Vice President Pence's Domestic and Economic Policy team. Please join me in welcoming him to the podium.
Thank you, Gretchen. Today we have the honor of hosting Ori Renat, the White House's Chief Digital Officer, for a conversation on the intersection of digital media and politics. Mr. Renat has been in the forefront of digital innovation in political media for over a decade, including digital roles at the State Department, Heritage Foundation, Daily Signal, and Atlantic Media. Today's discussion could not be more timely, as organizations across the political landscape increase the complexity and scale of their digital efforts. Some have found tremendous success unlocking powerful platforms to engage directly with Americans, while others have stumbled through disastrous implementations. Mr. Renat's perspective will offer us tremendous insight into how digital media can effectively engage and inform the American people. We are also honored to host Gilad Edelman, who will moderate our discussion. Mr. Edelman covers the intersection of technology and politics for Wired. His recent work includes coverage of disinformation in political campaigns, digital privacy, and big tech's possibly anti-competitive behavior. Thank you for joining us here at the IOP. Please join me in welcoming our guests.
Thanks for having us. So I thought we'd start with some basics, bio stuff. So what is Donald Trump's Twitter password?
Password 123.
You can write it down. No, I thought we would start, Ori, by having you just explain what it is that you do in broad strokes.
Yeah.
Then we'll jump back in time a little bit, and then we'll come
Sure.
back to the present, and we can get into the weeds a little bit more.
Yeah. So White Houses have had digital operations since the Clinton years. You guys know what the Wayback Machine is, that site where you can go look at the internet, how it used to be? Check out the Clinton era website, and you'll see how things have evolved, but also how they've stayed the same. And each digital team, each administration's digital team, is very different. It's different because of the president. It's different because of the era. Our team is focused on producing content that explains the president's messages, the president's policies, directly to the American people. That's the simplest way of understanding it. We're a team of designers, videographers and video editors, web developers and technologists, marketing strategists and communications campaign strategists, not political campaign strategists, and writers and editors. And so in a lot of ways, we're a little bit like a publishing operation or a newsroom. We're a little bit like a standard communications team, but everything we do is for the internet, which means when we think about producing content, we think about what is the experience when somebody's looking at this on the phone, in their hands, on their computer, without the filter of the press.
So how did you end up doing this?
Yeah. So I've been in this role for coming up on 3 years now. I was working on the Donald Trump transition team while also working at the Heritage Foundation. A lot of us at Heritage played a role in the transition. And we, during transition, we thought a lot about what kinds of roles and functions would be necessary to get going right away to implement the president's agenda. But also, our team was thinking a lot about what does whitehouse.gov look like? How does it function? How do you figure out changing who controls the Twitter account at 12:01 p.m. while also launching a new website and flipping a Facebook page and putting out content and covering an inauguration? And you want to get to the ball, too, because it's a lot of fun. So a lot of moving pieces. And so since transition, a lot of us have been working on various roles in the administration, and mine has been focused on digital.
But let's back up even more, because there's a lot of people here who are probably considering going into politics or communications, or maybe they have better ideas. So take us back. You and I actually we were just talking, we're at Columbia at about the same time, although we didn't cross paths too much. But what was your path? Since you're my age, I think we can cover all this and not take up all the time.
Yeah. So working backwards in chronological order, I was at the Heritage Foundation. Before that, I was at a consulting firm owned by The Atlantic Media Company, publishes The Atlantic magazine. And we built a consulting firm there that was focused on helping organizations and brands tell a story the way a reporter would or the way a publication would. So instead of saying, hey, here's a press release, how do you really build platforms and experiences and content that tells your story? Heritage was one of our big clients, and I moved over to work for Heritage from there. Before that, I was at Atlantic Media for about 7 years in various roles, including running strategy for National Journal, working on the chairman's research and strategy team, figuring out how our brands would approach the era of video, the era of email newsletters, how we would deal with the fact that the entire digital ecosystem was changing and affecting the way publishers made money, were able to reach their audiences. What kinds of companies did we want to buy? Who did we want to invest in to be able to do that? And before that, I was on political campaigns, none of them successful, including the Giuliani presidential campaign, a New Jersey Senate race where I was research director.
From New Jersey, I'm sure I saw a lot of ads for that one. So let's get a little bit more into what the White House digital team does. And my first question is, what's the relationship between the White House digital operation and the campaign? Because you hear a lot about what the campaign's up to.
Yeah.
So how much overlap, how much separation is there?
Yeah, so there's a lot of separation. And I think it's important that there be, we follow the law. And the Hatch Act, gives us some interesting guidelines, some helpful guidelines on where those lines are. We don't want to be using taxpayer dollars to say, vote for Trump. That's what the campaign is there for. Our job is to talk about the president's policies, the president's accomplishments. The good news for us, at least in my opinion, is there are a lot of accomplishments to talk about. And so our focus is saying, what does the White House as an institution want to convey today? What is the president's message today? You read a lot of stories about the great work the campaign is doing, and they're able to do incredible things around data, around targeting, around SMS programs, the Super Bowl ad that I enjoy watching and reading about too. But our team's very separate from that.
Speaking of, let's stick on that data point. I think something that I'm experiencing more and more as I cover tech and politics is that people use this big word tech to cover some pretty discrete categories of things. There's like literal technology, like what kind of, do you use Eventbrite or do you have your own platform? There's digital communications, right? Which with a heavy emphasis on how you use new platforms. And then there's the use of data, which overlaps a lot with the second one. So I'm curious how much as from your position running the White House operation, you're taking in data to inform, who's your audience, what message works best with them, and so on.
Yeah. We're looking at data the way really any other publisher would, and maybe a little bit less because of some rules and regulations that limit what we're able to do. So a big focus for us is something as simple as Google Analytics, and being able to say, whoa, whitehouse.gov is seeing a spike right now. Something's happening. There's a lot of traffic flowing to this one page. Why is that of interest? What else are we doing on that topic? It seems people are searching for information on this particular executive order. Okay, have we done enough to explain it? Did we make a video about it? Have we put it out in other places? Maybe we need the expert behind it to do a quick direct-to-camera video talking about why we just signed the EO. And the good part about being at the White House and being in our position is you have access to all the parts of the administration that have the expertise. So you can, say, get Secretary Azar of HHS to do a quick video about why the EO we just signed is going to help when it comes to kidney disease, for example.
Speaking of whitehouse.gov, I have to imagine that there's not a ton of just native traffic to the homepage there. I'm curious, what are the channels that you're seeing the most engagement from the stuff that you're putting out?
Yeah. So when I was at the Atlantic, we spent a lot of time thinking about how traffic gets to websites. And back then we were in a more web-centric era. We're now in a more platform era where most people are consuming content not on websites, but on other platforms. Think Facebook, think Twitter, think YouTube. And when we thought through that era, a lot of what we realized is what we call the rise of side door traffic. Any publisher. Could be the White House, could be University of Chicago, could be the New York Times. Anybody who has a website is seeing that most traffic doesn't come directly to your homepage. I think what's interesting about the White House website is how much of the traffic is search-driven. The reason for that is twofold. The first is we publish a lot of really relevant content people are looking for. If you want to read the text of the State of the Union, the first place you're going to go get it is whitehouse.gov. The first place Google is going to send you to go get it is whitehouse.gov. But we also get to have a lot of fun with evergreen content. Christmas decoration photos, bios of presidents through the years, content about the White House itself. When we rebuilt whitehouse.gov, one of the things we had to think through was how do we build a website that is the website of the Trump White House, and also build a website that is representing the White House as an institution, as a historic living archive.
You're one of the longest tenured White House employees. You've been there since February 2017. So a two-parter. One, how do you, advice for people how to not get fired by the Trump administration?
I've been at the White House a long time because I guess I haven't done anything wrong. But I think more importantly, I've wanted to stay at the White House all this time because our team has been able to do, I think, really incredible work redefining what it is to be a digital team in this era. Last year, we did 1.7 billion video views of White House videos without any advertising. We're not allowed to spend ad dollars on this stuff. That's a lot of engagement. And so I've wanted to stay at the White House because of the reach we're able to have, of the impact we're able to have, because we have a president who understands the role these platforms play in conveying a message. So I'll answer your question that way.
Very diplomatic. Speaking of the president understanding the role these platforms play, we can't have this conversation and not ask about the president's Twitter account. He has defined the use of Twitter in politics. If you think back 6 years, politicians just didn't tweet that much. Mm-hmm. And it's just, the world has completely changed, largely thanks to him. So what role does your office have in what's going out on the real Donald Trump account?
So I'll dodge that question too with a different answer. I think one thing that's interesting is if you think about, this is an articulation of how much things have changed. If you think about the Barack Obama era, tweets written by him were signed -BO, his initials. There was an era not too long ago where nobody expected politicians to manage their own social accounts. Nobody expected politicians to be the ones behind their own platforms. Twitter wasn't an authentic place in politics. And if you look at it right now, the things that drive engagement, the platforms that drive engagement, the brands that drive engagement, they're individuals. They're not larger organizations. Bet you anything, if you look at the Twitter account for, I don't know, the president of the University of Chicago, you'll see a higher rate of engagement per follower than for the University of Chicago itself. Because people engage with people, and you want to believe that the person whose stuff you're reading is the one who actually wrote it, or at the very least that they read it before somebody else sent it out for them. And so I think what wasn't working about the Twitter era of pre-2016 on either side of the aisle was the lack of authenticity and the lack of the involvement of the candidate or politician themselves in the creation of the content. Some politicians are going to be more comfortable picking up the phone and doing the tweeting themselves. Congressman Dan Crenshaw is awesome at just making videos explaining what's going on. AOC walks through the hallways of Congress making videos too. The more authentic, the more believable, I think, the more it resonates.
Yeah, I'm glad you brought up AOC because my next question was going to be, I'm curious how you evaluate I was going to say the Democratic candidates right now. You can throw in any other Democrats you want, but just looking at the other side, who do you think is using digital platforms well? Whose digital operation do you think is not so good?
Okay, how do I answer this question diplomatically? So here's what I'll say was interesting. When you're running a campaign, whether you're working in an organization, whatever it is, how much control you keep of your own brand versus how much you decentralize it is a really important decision to make. And the more you decentralize it, the more risk you're taking. Are you going to let everybody else take your logo, edit it, manipulate it however you want as long as they make it their own? Or are you going to say our logo's our logo, our brand's our brand, and you're going to stay right here in our guidelines? There's a campaign of a leading Democratic candidate who early on built a tool on their website that let anybody go in and change the logo, change the colors, make their own, put it on a bumper sticker, put it on a t-shirt, export it. From a design standpoint, it was very impressive.
So it actually wasn't obvious to me whether you were describing this as a virtue or a vice.
Virtue, I think. I mean, it's a risk, but people expect to be able, if they're going to post content, they're going to want to make it their own. You know, you go to these websites sometimes and it gives you a chance to tweet the thing that's on the website, and they will have pre-populated the tweet for you. There was an era where everybody would just, yeah, cool, I'm going to post that tweet exactly as it appeared on the website. That doesn't happen as much anymore. It's not as authentic.
Yeah, when I'm lucky enough for somebody to read one of my articles, it is funny to see a lot of people will just retweet the headline of the article. I'm like, why bother?
Yeah.
Just do the link at that point. Yeah. So for whatever reason, you don't want to give credit or criticism to any of the Democratic campaigns, but whichever mystery campaign out there is encouraging people to play with and customize their content, you think that's a good move?
I really do. Yeah, I think that's, it empowers people to make the brand their own.
Let's flip it. What are some worst practices on the digital side, both for campaigns and office holders, right?
So I think the number one thing people do wrong in digital, and sometimes government really struggles with this, not at the White House level as much as when you get into smaller kind of sub-cabinet agencies, there'll be a desire to say, okay, we just released this report. Everybody should want to read this report. I'm going to put out this entire 200-page report. I'm going to tweet a link to the PDF, and everybody's going to download it. Forgetting the fact that the font is so small that when you try to open it on your phone, the PDF's never going to load, and if it does, you'll never be able to read it. I rant about PDFs a lot. They're kind of the enemy. When you forget to speak like a human, and you forget you're talking to humans, digital really isn't that hard. It's hard to do really well when you get into the tactical, the coding, the user experience design. But understanding digital is really about speaking like a human being, being authentic, and remembering that your audience are people. We don't live in an era anymore where you have to write websites with keywords all over them so that the search engines pick them up. You are writing for people who will actually be reading this stuff.
What was it like doing this while the president was getting impeached, and how has that shifted since his acquittal?
Yeah, so it was a very interesting time, impeachment. We saw, first of all, we're able to see the levels of interest in impeachment as a topic. And for a number of months there, really going back to when the inquiry started, this was the top issue in politics every single day. And what we noticed towards the end, especially after the Democrats presented their case, was a significant drop. We saw the 2020 campaign being a bigger issue. We saw coronavirus being a bigger issue. We saw a lot of other issues that were drawing.
When you say, so I'm sorry, but you're talking about, give the audience a sense of what your data points are here when you're talking about what's a big issue.
The number of people tweeting about something, the number of news articles being published about something and then being shared and how often those things are shared. Publicly available metrics that the internet is really sending signals on what is of interest to people.
So journalists are routinely and I think rightly criticized for paying a lot of attention to Twitter and not that much attention to everything that's not Twitter, which is also the world. But it's interesting to me that you mentioned Twitter, Twitter buzz, Twitter engagement. How do you think about the relationship between Twitter and the real world?
Yeah. So I think, first of all, in technology and in digital, there is an insane amount of bias towards Twitter, towards using Twitter and relying on it too much, for the simple reason that it is the easiest tool to get data and insights from. Facebook and Instagram have closed their APIs in such a way that you're not able to say.
Tell them what an API is.
API is a thing that you use to pull data from a platform. Sorry, I went into tech world there a little. They've made it harder to say, here's how many times somebody said something on Facebook. Twitter makes it easier. And so news articles, news sites, when they talk about what people are saying on the internet, Axios does a really good job at this. People are relying really heavily on Twitter as a signal, and Twitter doesn't represent what the American people think. Neither does Facebook on its own, neither does YouTube on its own, neither does the press on its own, neither does polling. So the best thing we can do is take a look at all the data available to us, recognize that none of it is perfect, and understand the limitations of each to figure out a really complete picture of what is of interest to people. How are people looking at issues? How can we, as a government and as a White House, provide people with the information they're looking for? Are they saying, hey, this budget is out, I want to understand more about what's in it? Or are they already diving into the details and we want to highlight things that are in it that we think are especially good?
How has this work changed? Even the 3 years you've been there, the technology, the platforms that we're relying on changed so fast. Like if you went back another 3 years to 2014, the world would be unrecognizable. So how has your work changed just in the 3 years, the breezy just 3 years of the Trump administration so far?
It's a great question. We've decided to become more reliant on simpler, easy to use open source platforms. Rather than building a custom tool for sending email newsletters, we use one that most organizations use because it works and it's easy and it's effective and it's fast. And there's a mobile app we could use to check stats and send out emails or whatever we need to do. We as a White House, I think, are more reliant on low cost, high quality, private sector tools than past White Houses have been. And that evolution has become a lot easier. This all goes back to the same thing. Digital isn't hard as long as you're creating a high quality experience people want to engage with.
What do you think are the most important channels of communication that you use?
So I think Twitter is important. There's no way around it. And it's not important just because people are on Twitter, reading it on Twitter. I'd say that's secondary at best. It's because it's a place people look to, and then that content lives elsewhere. So you put out a particular tweet. We put one out right after the State of the Union about Pelosi ripping up the speech. We put this tweet out on the White House Twitter account. And the next day, all over Instagram, people have screenshotted that and put it up on Instagram on their own accounts.
How consciously are you baiting the media when you do that? Because we can't help it.
Honestly, we just thought it was a good tweet that needed to be pointed out. We didn't think that was going to happen.
Okay, but there's, on the media side, there's been a lot of hand-wringing about the ethics and the pragmatics of covering what level of attention to pay to the president's tweets, whatever they're about, right? Sure, whatever they're about. Some categories of that are, okay, does this count as an official policy change? Was this offensive and racist? Was this a joke? And so when you're designing this content strategy, how do you think about how the media, and we might say different parts of the media, right? There's the conservative media, there's the mainstream media, which you might have another word for, there's liberal sites and channels. How do you think about how media is going to respond to the material you're putting out?
So I think it's actually a question of how journalists generally should be responding to the fact that the platforms and tools and mechanisms used to get out a message have changed. And I actually don't think it's as tied to what side of the aisle the reporter thinks they're opposing or supporting. Press releases, why? I mean, you're a reporter, right? You get a press release, and yeah, sure, some reporters will just copy and paste, but most just delete. And we've gotten to a point where digital is the mechanism by which politicians, organizations, the White House communicates. Sometimes we break news on Twitter because we've decided that rather than sending out a statement from the official office of the press team and here's a big formal release, we just want to tell people what's going on really quickly. So for reporters to say, we need to figure out how to cover Twitter differently than other things, cover the substance. It doesn't matter what platform it's on, especially now that we're past the 140 characters thing. Tweets are a little bit longer. Tweets can have embedded documents or images or video or whatever it is. Cover the substance. Write about the substance. Ideally, write about it in a way that's fair, please, and not just anti-Trump. But like, look at the substance of what people are saying.
On the one hand, the president is undeniably an innovator in the medium here. On the other hand, he and his campaign have been criticized a lot for things like disinformation, amplifying conspiracy theories, as the president sometimes has been known to do from his personal account, using divisive content, especially using micro-targeting tools on Facebook. I'm curious what your reaction is to the criticisms that there was. I'm sure you saw the big Atlantic article last week that took the position that the Trump campaign digital communication strategy is essentially a disinformation campaign. Oh, and just let's add to the bill of particulars, encouraging distrust in the media.
So I'll mention a particular example. There was a video, I think it was maybe, I don't know, a couple weeks back, months back, that the media in the New York Times called a doctored video. That video was a parody that was, I think, clearly a parody that had indications on it of parody. That wasn't a Trump campaign video, but it was in the political space. I think sometimes there's a rush to use the word disinformation, and we shouldn't cheapen how risky real disinformation is and how much manipulated efforts can jeopardize the way people, especially in other countries, understand threats against them, the information ecosystem, the information space. You look at, for example, the conversation around 5G in Europe. There is so much disinformation about 5G in Europe, minimizing the dangers of certain approaches. And that's happening in a way that's really, really well orchestrated in a scary way. So I'm not part of the Trump campaign, but on a personal level, I didn't agree with the premise of that piece. I think that
let's take one slice of it, though, which is the antagonistic relationship toward the media. You now work for the Trump White House, but you used to work for the media,
yeah.
Right? Atlantic Media. I don't think it's. I think it's hard to dispute. I think that the president really encourages his followers or anybody out there to disbelieve what they read in the media and only believe what's coming from him.
So I don't grant the premise. I think that what we've seen are a lot of situations where the press has had to walk back claims they've made, statements they've made. Just a couple weeks ago, we put out a video showing all the times the press had said there's clear evidence of collusion, there's clear evidence of collusion. No, there wasn't, and the Mueller report said there wasn't. So there have been examples when the press has, I don't want to say done the wrong thing on purpose, but a rush to judgment. And I think that what I hope digital platforms allow people to do is find the true information for themselves. There are so many perspectives out there, and this is why we get into really complicated areas when we talk about who should be a fact checker, who should be fact checking what's true and what's not. on social platforms, what is the role of fact-checking? The audience gets to decide that. And the audience in the digital era isn't limited to one homepage with one platform and one piece of information. They get to dig in deeper and say, okay, hold on. Somebody's telling me that the budget increases spending for this. Somebody's telling me it cuts spending for this. Somebody's saying it's bad. Somebody's saying it's good. Go look at the document. It's all there.
This sounds like an almost nihilistic theory, though, of how people are going to gather information, where there's no, or nihilistic might not be the right word, but where you're describing a world in which everybody is sort of just confronted with, thousands of sources of information, and we expect them to just, it's like tossing them a laptop and like, hey, go figure it out.
So our job is to take the information the government produces and make it easier to access. Figure out how are we making sure that people can get into the information they need so they're not sorting through a deep, dark website of spreadsheets where they'll never find what they're looking for. It's how do we make, whether it's budget data or a clip of all the times the president has made the case for increased burden sharing and proving the point that this is a long-standing concern of the White House, or highlighting all the hypocrisy when it comes to impeachment from some of the people who were on the Senate floor and the things they used to say differently in 1998. The evidence is there. Our job is to pull it together, make it easy to access. We're going to add our perspective. We're going to explain what our message and what our point of view is. Other people get to do that too.
An interesting dynamic with the Trump administration is that, on the one hand, the president's very reliant, and the campaign are very reliant on the social media platforms. And good for their business, you might add. We were talking about this a little bit before this conversation about how Twitter in particular, it's hard to imagine that brand being as strong as it is without the use the president has made of it. But at the same time, there's a very antagonistic relationship. And in particular, not just the president, but Republicans in general, conservatives in general, I should say, are commonly argue that the platforms are biased against conservatives. What do you make of this dynamic where on the one hand, the administration is making really good use of these tools, but at the same time sees them as somehow antagonistic?
So people talk a lot about censorship, or tech bias for short. And in private, the tech platforms, Facebook, Twitter, Google, everybody, they'll tell you, and some of them have said it publicly, that there tends to be more action taken to censor, hide, what they call actioning, accounts that have a right-leaning perspective than a left-leaning perspective. They would say that that is not driven by intent, that their intent is not to be biased. And when people say it doesn't matter that 95% of the staff working for these companies is liberal, I agree. It's not like some engineer said, oh, I don't like the president, so I'm going to code this thing and I'm going to make it really terrible for Republicans. But what we do see is that these platforms have put in place a series of mechanisms and tools that, with or without intent, tend to have an impact that is disproportionately negative for conservatives. I'll give you an example. One of the platforms, until about 6 months ago, would only take a look at a piece of content as to whether or not that content violated a rule if users had flagged that content. So when you say, hey, report this is violating the rules, it took somebody reporting it for the platform to look at the content. The more people reported it, the sooner they would look at it. At least that's how they explain it. Makes sense, right? There are some things we don't want on these platforms. Harmful content, terrorist content for sure. But what happens when a group of people on the left, let's say, organizes around flagging those pieces of content as violating the rules when they don't? And then,
but why would people on the left be any more likely to do that than people on the right?
I don't know, but they are. And the platforms themselves will tell you that they are. I think the same reason people on the left are more likely to protest than people on the right. Right? I mean, that's a sociological dynamic.
There's another way of interpreting the underlying phenomenon here, though, which is that people on the right online are more likely to post things that in fact violate the community standards of these platforms.
And I think that that's, first of all, we have to talk about how these community standards are being interpreted, and I think there are some inconsistencies in how they're being interpreted. Again, I don't think there's necessarily an intent there, but we do see cases where somebody on the left will say, all blank people are evil. And somebody on the right will say, all blank people are evil. And the person on the right will have their content taken down, and the person on the left will not. We see a lot of situations where content is marked as sensitive, in particular on Instagram, and there are downstream effects to that. A prominent Republican on 9/11 posted a picture of one of the people jumping out of one of the towers. And the caption on the post was something along the lines of, "We can never let a tragedy like this happen again." Very sensitive, very appropriate. As a result of user flags, that post got marked as sensitive, which means there's a filter on top of it, and you have to click the filter to be able to see the content. Makes sense, right? Maybe we don't want children to have to see those photos. Maybe we think everybody should have to see them. I don't know. It's a tough decision. But what happened? Instagram took a shortcut because you're trying to make money, you don't have infinite resources, and sometimes you take shortcuts. The shortcut they took was that if your piece of content had been marked as sensitive, you would be suppressed in search results for a given number of weeks. The more sensitive the content, the longer you'd be suppressed in search results. So a conservative can't be found on Instagram for a couple of weeks because he posted a picture about 9/11.
But buddy, you used to work at Heritage, right? You're a good libertarian. This sounds great, right? We've got private companies making and enforcing their own policies, and then we're letting the market decide.
Well, you haven't heard me go into what the solution should be to this.
I'm all
Right?
ears.
I'm not here saying regulation or no regulation. CNN had a piece about what the administration is doing about these issues, what policy plans we have in place. I'll tell you that the CNN piece is entirely wrong, but it's a process we're working through to figure out what the right solution is. And that doesn't mean necessarily that a regulatory solution can work. There are a lot of ideas out there. At the Social Media Summit last July, the president brought Josh Hawley up on the stage to talk about his bill. The Hawley bill would effectively say that the rule that gives platforms immunity for taking down content would only apply if those platforms are certified as being neutral. Okay.
So just to give a little bit of background on what we're talking about here, because this is getting a little bit into the weeds. So Section 230 of the Communications Decency Act, which is a law passed in 1996, and this is just a little clause buried in the law that no one even really paid attention to at the time, basically says, it says two things. One, it says platforms can moderate content on them. Mm-hmm. without opening themselves up to liability. And then on the flip side, it says they can't be sued for stuff that users are posting. So that's why we live in a world in which I can, I can slander you on Twitter, as perhaps you have been slandered on Twitter, and Twitter is not legally liable for that. And so what Senator Hawley's bill would do is suspend that immunity from liability if a company was found through some kind of audit process to be discriminating against one party or the other?
Yeah, so exactly. And I'm being really careful not to take a position on this because this is incredibly complicated, and I don't think anybody's figured out the exact right answer yet. Because if you think about it, the whole premise here is that platforms aren't publishers. The person publishing the content is a publisher. It's especially important in the space of copyright. Because if somebody goes on Facebook and posts a video that isn't theirs, that they stole, Facebook will take it down if the person who actually owns the video says, hey, please take that down. But if Facebook could now be sued for that, then all of a sudden Facebook's going to really have to limit what people can post because they don't want to be sued for the fact that you stole that video from Disney or something when you posted a clip of, I don't know, The Lion King because you thought it was funny. Okay, but who should have liability for doing that? And getting that right is really important because if you get it wrong, you can have a chilling effect on speech. I think the key point here is these platforms get a lot of leeway, a lot of immunity that other companies and other industries don't necessarily get. And that, over the course of the development of the internet, has played an important role. But in policy, we should be continuously looking of what are the rules of the road, what are the special perks, if you will, given to industries, why, and does that support the values we have in this country? And the First Amendment applies to government. It doesn't apply to companies, right? Companies don't have to abide by it, but the principle of free speech is an important one. And so we're taking the time, I think a lot of people in Washington on all sides of the aisle are taking the time to think through what are some solutions to this. Personally, I think the platforms themselves can solve a lot of this by creating more significant and easier to use avenues to appeal. Because these platforms themselves will say, sometimes we get it wrong. They'll apologize when they get it wrong. The problem is when they realize they got it wrong, apologized, and reinstated the content of the user 6 days after it happened, and the entire point and the issue in the news cycle has changed already. And that person lost their ability to make their point, to contribute to that conversation. And so on a personal level, I hope these platforms invest more in creating an appeals process that's more meaningful.
Well, Facebook, excuse me, Facebook is sort of about to get their Supreme Court, as it's being informally called, up and running, so we'll see how that works. Facebook is impaneling a supposedly truly independent body to handle appeals to choices that it makes over taking down or flagging content. And supposedly even Mark Zuckerberg himself can't overturn or go against any of their rulings. It'd be very interesting to see what happens.
And I hear some laughs in the audience as you say that, supposedly neutral. I don't think that's a criticism of Facebook. I think what we're getting at is how hard is it to say who should be the arbiter of truth? And we're not, as a society, saying we want platforms to allow anything. One of the things that these companies have done really well is through the Global Internet Forum for Countering Terror, they have built practices and mechanisms to take down terrorist content, almost all of it automatically, and almost all of it within 2 hours. They do that by actually sending signals to each other. So if YouTube takes down an ISIS video, there's what they call a hash to that video, a signal that tells them, all right, here are the identifiers of this video, and they'll share it with the other platforms so that if then ISIS tries to post that somewhere else, the other guys can take it down right away too, because without a person even looking at it, they recognize that it's the same video. Those are great things. And a completely lawless, free-for-all, anybody can post anything they want, wouldn't allow for that. So we have to find the right balance. And it'll be interesting to see what Facebook does with their new board.
Yeah, there's a lot of conflicting ideas in here, right? Because the premise of a proposal like Josh Hawley's, where you're going to have an audit to decide how biased a platform is against one side or the other, seems to be putting the government in the position, and whoever is running, the auditors, of deciding what's true and what's biased. And that seems like tossing a match onto this little fire that's already burning.
That actually, a lot of people on the right have criticized the Hawley bill, including the Heritage Foundation that came out against the Hawley bill on those grounds. It's not an easy question.
This has gotten pretty policy heavy, but before we came out here, you were telling me about something a little bit lighter, which I found interesting, which was working on the redesign of the White House logo. Can you tell me about that?
That was really fun. So government wasn't designed to be a digital institution. And so it's not like every single federal agency has a style guide and sticks to it and everybody knows what logo to use. And we started noticing this during transition and even the first couple weeks of the administration. To find the right logo to use for the White House, for the State Department, for whatever, even now at federal agencies, and before we did this at the White House, people would go on Google Images to find the logo. Because it's not like the State Department or the Department of whatever said, here is our logo, here's exactly how to use it, and everybody knows that. And so you've gotten into an era where a lot more people are using logos and printing them on documents or invitations or wherever. But in the past, those same people in similar roles hadn't done it. When we came into the White House, there were 7 different White House logos in use, going back to the Clinton years. They were completely different. There was one from the Obama era that looked like the regular White House logo, but had a little bit of a swirl in the background. Some had shadows for the columns in front of the White House. Some were showing the south side of the White House. And a brand like the White House, a pretty prominent and noticeable one, should have a single logo. So we did what any company would do, which is go through a logo redesign process and consolidate that. And the things we had to think through were what any company in a digital era has to think through. How is this going to look on mobile? How is this going to look in a tiny little box above a Twitter bio? How is this going to look from far away on signage? And what we realized was, first of all, simplicity is good. You don't need shadows. You don't need swirls in the background. You want a logo that can be used in a lot of different ways in a lot of different places. You want a logo that is not at all political, that's going to be able to outlast any one administration, and it has to be accurate. So we literally had people standing on the White House lawn counting the arches above the windows to make sure we got them right. And they alternate between like triangle arches and swirl arches, and an Obama logo had them flipped, and we like had to fix that. So it's very in the weeds, it's very dorky, and it's really fun. But the inspiration for all of this was actually the British. They've done something I think really incredible, which is figure out that they're one government, and that everything the British government does should look like it's the British government. And so they have, for pretty much everything they do, a single logo. It's a vertical line, the name of the office or program in the same font, and the crown of the queen right on top of it. And apparently she gave permission to use her crown as the symbol for this, and that's it. And it's super simple. And taxpayers don't want to pay for branding firms and consulting firms to make more and more logos. So I think as government, we have an obligation to create, like a logo, digital things that are really simple, but not waste time and money overcomplicating it.
We're going to open up the Q&A now. So there's a microphone here. So you can begin lining up if you have questions. The first 3 questioners, I'm told by tradition, are to be students. So before you line up, ask yourself, am I a student? If the answer is no, hold off. And friendly reminder to questioners to make sure that what you say can plausibly have a question mark at the end.
Okay, so hi, I'm Andre. I'm a first-year MPP at the Harris School, and I've done some research on just the social media used by President Trump and also by the Prime Minister of India, and I've noticed that there are many similarities between the two in terms of their online strategies. So in particular, I've looked at how they've used negativity in terms of content creation. So do you think, in your experience, also, like with the White House Twitter account retweeting like President Trump's tweets, is negativity, in particular the more personal brand of negativity, like personal attacks on character, do you think that's more effective in terms of getting the president's message out there? Just because I've noticed it being used to great effect in terms of retweets and favorites. So in your opinion, what's the answer?
So you're saying you're seeing more engagement on tweets that have a negative message versus a positive message?
Yes, and especially in terms of personal attacks.
Okay, and you're saying you see the same thing when it comes to India as well?
Yes.
Interesting. So I have not looked at the Indian side of things, and as we announced, the president's going there in a couple of weeks, so that's interesting data. I think tweets and social posts that say something drive engagement. I mean, after State of the Union, we saw so much engagement around the story of Charles McGee, the World War II veteran who got promoted to general that day and was featured at the State of the Union. That wasn't a negative message. We got a lot of engagement around that. I think the American political landscape right now is divided. We can't pretend it's not. And we're in an election year, which makes things more divided. And so maybe that makes things that are not entirely about unity more engaging and drives people to share them more. But I think what we've seen is the things that drive engagement are the things that have a message people want to share. I mean, what fundamentally determines whether something will do well online? How many video views something will get, how many people will see it. It's whether people are willing to share it. And what decides whether people are going to share something or not? What drives whether they're going to share it or not? Do they want to say, yeah, I agree with that? Replying to something on Twitter is one thing. Retweeting it is saying, yeah, I agree. I'm with them. That makes sense to me. And so what I loved about the State of the Union is the most engaged with, retweeted, shared moments were about some of these guests who were, I think regardless of party, really uplifting figures.
Hello, my name is Utsav. I'm a second year at the Harris School. I'm wondering, on a fundamental level of operating the Twitter handle or the Facebook account on a daily basis, what's your strategy to engage with people who don't agree with you? I'm not talking of media, like a news article, but just individuals who may not be supportive.
Yeah. So one thing you'll notice is the White House won't respond to direct messages on Twitter. That's deliberate, and it's about making sure that we're cataloging and recording all interactions when people send the White House messages. So that happens at whitehouse.gov/contact, where we hear from people who agree with us, people who don't agree with us, and there's an office dedicated to responding to that kind of incoming information. Broadly speaking, we know that not everybody agrees with us, and we know that not everybody who sees our content agrees with us. And we get to make our point, and we get to put out our message just like any administration does, and like every administration has before. And you hope that people approach it with an open mind. And a lot of what we try to do as a White House digital team is not just tell, but also show. It's one thing, I was giving the impeachment example, it's one thing to say, in 1998, Democrats said there should never be a one-sided partisan impeachment. Okay, maybe people believe you, maybe they don't, maybe they think, yeah, okay, they kind of said that. But when we can show the exact video of these members of Congress making, I think, really legitimate points about the impact of impeachment when it comes to dividing the country, it's the showing that I think cuts through whether people agree with you or not. And at times, we're in a rush and we forget, and we'll just do a quick tweet that says it. But when we do our jobs really well, we're showing it.
Hi, my name is Sophie. I'm a first year here at the college. I just had a question about security because you mentioned kind of revamping the White House, whitehouse.gov, and using, I think you said, low-cost, high-volume tools from the private sector. So do using tools like that have security implications?
We have to be really careful of that, yeah. There's a federal standard called FedRAMP. This is super wonky IT stuff, where these tools have to be certified for compliance. And so we look at whether they've done that, where they are in the process. Some of this stuff is, if you, even as regular people, if you have accounts and you don't have two-factor authentication on your accounts, that's really risky. Make sure you have two-factor authentication on. For us, we do that and then more. But yeah, when you have a sensitive platform that people are constantly trying to hack, making sure that we think through the security side of it is a hurdle. And I think it's why in the past, governments have had to invest so much money building it on their own because there wasn't confidence in those commercially available tools from a security standpoint. There are still a lot of commercially available tools we don't use. I would love to be using Slack. You guys know what Slack is? Like, the fact that we can't use Slack kills me. We'd be so much more effective if we could. But
I don't know, man. As someone who uses Slack a lot, I'm not convinced it's making me any more productive.
as someone who can only use email, I miss Slack.
Yeah, email's
But
bad.
we're not at a point where we feel like we can use that for our particular purpose. So there's an evaluation process. And I think that as the private sector realizes the importance of cybersecurity, they have realized it, as they implement it across the board, I think a lot of these tools will rise to the level of being able to be used. And hopefully that means that not just at the White House, but at the state and local level, governments can reduce reliance on custom-built tools and save taxpayers a lot of money.
Hi, my name is Annalise, and I'm a second year at the Harris School. And my question is maybe for both of you. So coming off of the malfunctions that happened in Iowa last week, the thing that was particularly disturbing to me was the rapid spread of disinformation coming from all sides. People picked up stories that sort of fit their narrative and really ran with them. And I think that bodes really poorly for the upcoming election. So what can we do to prevent that spread of disinformation, to ensure that those stories don't take off the way that they did without limiting free speech for people on these platforms?
Yeah, and I think there are examples even around the world where disinformation narratives that have taken hold have led to violent attacks. And really kind of scary stuff, in particular with WhatsApp messaging. WhatsApp is not as big of a social network in America, right? Here we use it more as a one-to-one messaging app, but there are parts of the world where there are thousands of people in WhatsApp groups and information spreads really rapidly without being able to be monitored, understood, and those kinds of situations are of real concern. I think what was unique about Iowa was the fact that it was happening with only one of the parties, right? So it doesn't, in a general election, you have a clear person you go to. Usually it's the Secretary of State's office. And the Secretary of State of that particular state is the one who says, here are the election results, here's how to understand who won, who lost, where it stands, precincts reporting, all of that. And news outlets pull data from there. And so you end up with a clear source of information. And I don't know that I have a perfect solution here, because we're talking about a situation where there wasn't a nonpartisan government entity in charge of the election. As I understand it, and correct me if I'm wrong, it was the Iowa Democratic Party who was overseeing that caucus. In that sense, it was kind of a perfect storm of factors that allowed it to get to that point.
Do you think it would help if all the male members of the Trump family didn't tweet that the election had been rigged?
So I don't know that that happened. I don't know that I saw those tweets. And I don't think what people outside of Iowa are tweeting about election results tells people what the election results are, right? There should be easy ways to see real data and real results.
But the question was about disinformation specifically.
Yeah. I don't know that I have the perfect solution to disinformation and balancing it with free speech. I think that goes to, and I think the counterbalance to that, or the other side of that coin, is a lot of times we see things viewed as disinformation that turn out to be true. And the who gets to decide what's true is a really tough question for not just the internet, but for, I guess, speech generally. I'm not comfortable telling people who gets to decide what's true.
That's very relevant, Annalise, in the Iowa example, because here, one of the most viral nuggets of disinfo was a claim put out by I don't know what you'd call them, a conservative group called Judicial Watch. The number of registered voters in certain Iowa counties outnumbered the number of living adults. And the Iowa Secretary of State, who's a Republican, put out a statement and tweeted and whatever else, showing that that the numbers they were using for voter registration were wrong. And that was an example of there actually being a trusted source. And so I think that that particular piece of misinformation, well, misinformation would be it's an honest mistake, and disinformation would be an intentional one. So who knows? Didn't go as big as it otherwise might have, because there still are some people in our society who are seen as somewhat trusted arbiters of what's true, and state secretaries of state from whatever party fit into that category. It's when you don't have somebody like that things can really go wild.
Evening, my name's Dave Komanecki. How did your digital team handle family separation when it was in effect? And how do they handle the current Remain in Mexico policy, where Central Americans are in dangerous Mexican border towns waiting months for their amnesty hearings?
So let me, first of all, answer that question a little bit more broadly. Well, the first thing is to convey what the policy is. When you talk about misinformation, there was a magazine cover that showed a child crying purportedly because of separation. That turned out to be untrue, and to credit a lot of the quote mainstream media, they call that out as being untrue. And so a lot of it is showing what is really happening. The other part about a lot of what happened during the era of all those kind of controversies was a lack of understanding about the rules that actually required certain actions and led to certain things. And look, a lot of people on the right said, well, Obama put kids in cages. Obama's not president now. So to me, it resonated, but I think there are stronger arguments and stronger pieces of information that are important to convey to people, including the impact of the Flores settlement from the Clinton era that limited the amount of days families could be kept together, the TVPRA rule, a lot of really complicated aspects of policy. And the Department of Homeland Security and others are much more expert at this than I am. But I think the role of the administration in conveying the policy is also explaining the how we got there. I think the 1600 Daily newsletter, particularly during that time, the White House evening newsletter that talks about what's going on that day, what the policy is, that's where the focus was then. Because unlike a shorter form social media platform, it let us explain in a lot more detail the what, the why, the background, the history of it to an audience of people who had said, yeah, I want to get an email that explains things in more detail. And when you're talking about an issue that rightly brings up a lot of different viewpoints and a lot of heated perspectives, I think that's a moment for us to say, okay, how can we slow down and provide more information? So email newsletters are a big part of the focus for us in that space. The other one we do is West Wing Reads. Every morning we send out a summary of what the West Wing is reading today. 3 to 5 articles, op-eds, stories that we think are especially resonant and good at conveying what's going on, sharing a different perspective. Sometimes they are news articles, sometimes they're op-eds. When the Washington Post gave Adam Schiff 4 Pinocchios, we put that in there for sure. Then we made a little GIF of it because you can have fun with it too, but it's how do you tell the larger story? And digital, for a while there, people thought digital meant short form, meant really quick, meant snippets, meant 8-second vines. I think what everybody's realizing, including the New York Times with their daily podcast, with their weekly show, including shows like John Oliver's, people whose perspective I don't agree with, but from a strategy perspective, what they're showing is that longer form can work, and that digital lets you find an audience for the larger argument, for the longer conversation, for the more in-depth understanding of policy and how we got there and what it is.
Hi, my name is Alexandra. I'm a second year in the college. I was wondering if any of President Trump's tweets are reviewed by White House staff before they're published or like put onto Twitter.
So we don't talk about the Twitter process.
Okay.
And I'll leave it there.
You tried.
Thank
You had to ask.
Hi, my name is Charles Brandel. I'm interested to hear about your specific KPIs that you're measured against, and then also what type of regular data do you provide to the administration that you guys activate?
Yeah. So we do a weekly analytics report that
What's
looks.
a KPI?
KPI is a key performance indicator. I like that question so much, I jumped in. So a key performance indicator is a stat. It's an analytic. It's something that you can look at over time to indicate if you're doing well or you're not. A big one for us is video views. In particular, what we're looking at is how many people viewed a particular piece of content. We also dig into how many people viewed it to the end or past 10 seconds.
What's a good result and a bad one? What's a number of views for a video you guys put out that it's like, wow, we really killed it on this one, and then what's one where you're like, why did we even try?
We aim to be over 1 million on each one across platforms. So you'll see 300 to 500,000 on Twitter, about the same on Instagram, depends TBD on Facebook. But generally, we hope to get above 1 million on a video we publish. If it's just a quick news clip or a quick clip from an event, here's 10 seconds of what the president said, maybe a little less. But generally, we try to be over 1 million. We get very happy if we break 10 million, which we've done a good number of times. Sometimes we'll break 30 million. You guys remember the Yanny Laurel thing? There was this weird audio recording, and some people heard Yanny, and some people heard Laurel. So we made a video about that. And we asked a bunch of people in the White House what they heard, and then we asked the president what he heard. And the president said, I hear Kofefe. That video did very well obviously. Why? Because it was engaging and it was different and it showed a fun side of the president.
Imagine trying to watch that in even a year, let alone like 10 years.
Yeah.
What will future historians make of that?
Yeah, that's true. And one of the interesting things is how many times these videos and content we create gets seen on platforms we don't control. The First Lady did an incredible, really moving, really beautiful Christmas decoration the first year, and we did a video of it. And it did 25 million views that we know about on our platforms. But we also know it was played on TV at least 200 times. We can't measure the viewership for that. We could hire companies who could, but that's not worth the time or money. But this stuff gets used and shared in other ways. Another fun fact is that government doesn't own copyright the way private sector organizations do. So people take our stuff and use it a lot. They use it in ways that are critical of us. They use it in ways that are supportive of us. But what it means is that when we're creating a piece of content, it's going to be used in other ways and shared in other ways and have that additional reach. So that's broadly speaking on video and on sharing. The original question was on KPIs. And generally the answer is we do a weekly analytics report that looks at, among other things, video views, social engagement. The one thing we'll never look at is impressions. Impressions is a metric that digital platforms tend to show you of how many times somebody might have seen something or how many times something might have been loaded onto a page. Impressions means a slightly different thing depending on the platform, and it is pretty much an empty vanity metric. Marketing firms like doing it to show to CEOs because it makes them feel impressed because the number usually has a billion after it. But it's not a real number because it doesn't say what did the audience do in response to this content. When we think about emails, we don't care how many email newsletters we sent, how many people we sent it to. We care how many people opened it, how many people clicked on it. Because it's about how did the audience actually engage with this. So our KPIs are for video, social, and email in particular. We also look at web and other things. And when we do, the KPIs are about what did the audience do, not what did we do.
Well, if there are no other questions, I think we will call it a night. Let's thank Ori for being here with us. And thanks everyone for coming.